Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here. Another bright, hot, beautiful day here in the People's Republic of Illinois. Today I want to talk about optics for rifles. I had a couple commenters ask me over the last 2 or 3 videos that they're kind of new to my channel, and one of them said he was new to guns in general and didn't really understand all the variations of optics that were out there. What would be best for his self-defense rifle. I think he was specifically talking about an M4 style carbine. And so I thought I'd do a couple videos on rifle optics and kind of do it as sort of a primer. So I hope I won't insult any of you folks that already know a lot about optics, but maybe I can tell you some things that you don't know and some tips that will help you do better. So if you want to hear about rifle optics, stay tuned. Now I'm pretty much a lover of all things with rifled barrels, especially like lever actions. And to me, putting an optic on a lever action just somehow doesn't seem right. But realistically, if it's a rifle that you can easily put an optic on, even for a lever action, optics make sense today. Even for us FUDs who like things the old-fashioned way. And really, when it comes to self-defense rifles, and we're primarily talking here about M4s, AR-15 platform, really the days of iron sights are behind us. Now, I think you should have iron sights on those rifles as a fallback safety feature. Ideally, I like those sights to fold down out of the way and give me a clear, unobstructed view for my optics. Then if something happens to an optic, or I'm in a condition where it's a detriment, I can use my quick detach mounts that I prefer, get that optic out of the way, pop up my sights, and I can still stay in the fight. Now, older eyes are not as good with sights, but I can tell you that even with old eyes, sights on an M4 or an AR-15 are really deadly out to 75 to 100 yards for almost all of us. But even the younger eyes can benefit from a good optic. And the primary factor that makes optics easier to shoot with, if you think about iron sights, we have the rear sight, the front sight, and the target in the distance. Now your eye can only focus on one plane at a time. And it's kind of interesting when I've gone into an eye doctor and worked with, how to improve my older vision with pistol sights. If they're not shooters, they don't understand that you shouldn't really focus on the target. You should focus on the front sight. That leaves your rear sight a little blurry, the target a little blurry. The degree of blurry is going to depend on your age, the prescription that your eye correction might be, and the lighting conditions. Under bright light, your eye will stop that iris down, just like stopping down the lens on the camera, and give you a greater depth of field, so the target's not going to be as fuzzy. But under some conditions, it's still going to be fuzzy, but we can still get really good hits. But with an optic, I don't have a rear sight, front sight, and target plane on which my eye can focus. Everything is on one plane of focus. And that simplifies everything, whether you got good eyes or bad, young eyes or old. Optics are an advantage if you choose carefully, mount them properly, and zero them properly. And today I'm going to talk mostly about how to zero these things, and maybe a factor that a lot of people don't realize enters in, and that's how far your optic sits above the bore of the rifle. It can really change the trajectory of where that bullet is going to impact. So that's what I'm going to talk about primarily today. Now, this discussion applies to all kinds of rifles, whether we're talking a bolt-action scout rifle with a long eye relief scope, a bolt-action hunting rifle, bolt-action sniper rifle, up to AR-15, AR-10 size semi-autos with those rather highly mounted optics that are necessary for that platform. So the principle is going to be the same, and I'll show you some of the differences when we get to how to sight about a high-mounted scope as opposed to a low-mounted scope. Now, the type of optic you're going to choose, best choice for you to choose, it really depends on the use that you're going to have for that particular rifle. For close range, self-defense use, this requires a different optic than something for long-distance hunting. There are some optics that can prove effective for multiple missions if you choose them carefully and you train with them and understand how to use them effectively. So first, let's start with some terminology. One of the primary things we need to know about how to zero a rifle is line of sight, and that line goes from your eye through the sighting system. We're talking iron sights. Our next point of contact is going to be the tip of that front post, and then the next point on that line will be the point on the target where we would like the bullet to impact. So line of sight is a straight line between our eye, where we want to hit on the target, and then interfacing in the middle of that is our aiming point. And as I said, it might be the front sight or the tip of the front sight if you're using metallic sights. It may be the red dot in the center of a red dot sight. It might be the crosshairs of a more conventional rifle scope with a normal style reticle. So that's line of sight. And ideally, we want our line of sight to interact with our point of impact. But that can generally only happen at either 1 or 2 points on the trajectory. Because bullet trajectory, from the moment a bullet leaves the barrel of a weapon, that is its highest velocity, its muzzle velocity, and it's also being pulled downward by the force of gravity. So from the moment it leaves the barrel, it's going to start dropping towards the ground. Now, if you think of Galileo, I believe it was, who dropped something light and something heavy off the Leaning Tower of Pisa and was amazed to find out that, gee, they hit the ground at the same time. So the weight of an object, the mass of an object, doesn't really have any difference in how fast it falls. The rate, the gravitational force is 32.16 feet per second squared. So if you think of something dropping from 0 downward velocity, at the end of 1 second, it will have reached a velocity of 32.16 feet per second. Now, it didn't fall 36 feet because it started at 0. So the average of that, 0, is 16 feet per second, roughly. But in the next second, it will accelerate again at 32. So now, at the end of the second second, it's going 64 feet per second, and such and such. Terminal velocity of a falling object is reached when the wind resistance equals the gravitational pull, and it reaches a point at which it cannot go any faster. That does not happen to us in small projectiles coming out of guns. But if you think about that, if I fire a rifle perfectly level with the ground over a very long level range, nothing to impact out there until, say, 2,000 yards, if I drop the same bullet at the same instant that I fire it level from a rifle, those 2 bullets will hit the ground at the same time. Now, they're not going to hit the ground at the same place. One will fall straight down at my feet. One will be out there hundreds of yards. How do we determine how many hundreds of yards before it impacts the ground? That depends on its muzzle velocity and essentially its ballistic coefficient, which tells us how fast the speed is going to decay because of air resistance. But when I get a time to drop of, I'm making this up, 0.2 of a second, once that bullet has flown down range for 0.2 of a second from a level firing, which we don't fire level, and I'll get to that in a minute, when we get to 0.2 seconds time of flight, whatever that distance is, that's where the bullet's going to hit the ground. One will be at my feet, one will be a couple 300 yards out there. That's the trajectory curve. It is always below, if you fire level, the trajectory is always below your line of sight because the scope sits up above the bore. If they're both level with the ground, the bullet's going down like this, it cannot rise up above, it cannot intersect that line of sight. For that reason, when we sight an optic on a rifle, the rifle barrel has to be pointed slightly upward. And some ballistic programs will give you an angle of departure. They're going to tell you, roughly what angle that barrel has to be pointed up at. We don't really care what the angle is because we don't have any way to to adjust that within what we can do to the scope, but we can adjust point of impact. So what we're looking for is for that trajectory to come up across the line of sight at a given distance. It will then typically rise above the line of sight until a high point called maximum ordinate. It will drop back down through the line of sight, and from that point it will always be below it, and we're going to have to do come-ups or reticles or things to adjust for that drop below our line of sight. It ain't that complicated. Now obviously, bullets that start out faster, bullets that have high ballistic coefficients and retain that velocity better, are going to have a much longer trajectory curve, and they're going to be a long range load compared to a short range load in the rifles we're going to use. Okay, I'm just going to move my ugly butt out of the way and do some diagramming here. And I'm going to show you both a high optical mount on an AR-15 M4 platform, and then we'll get to a low optical mount like we would have on a bolt action, lever action, or something like that. I'm going to use a standardized load for both of these. I'm going to use the .223, 5.56. I know they are not completely interchangeable, but we're going to say they are today. We're going to use the M193. That's the original 55 grain full metal jacket load. From a 16-inch barrel, the most common thing we're seeing on M4s nowadays, that's going to give us a muzzle velocity of about 3,050 feet per second. That will vary by brand, it will vary by model of the gun, things of that sort. That's going to be our standard. Now for the AR-15, so this is for personal defense, this is for police patrol rifles. It's also for military rifles using optics, which so many of them do nowadays. They're probably not going to be using that load. They're going to be using either an M55A1, which is not generally available to the public right now, or a heavier bullet load like the Mark 318 in the Marine Corps or the Mark 262 Mod 1 in Navy SEALs and Army and folks like that. But for simplicity's sake, 55 full metal jacket, muzzle velocity 3,050 in both rifles. Because of this straight line stock, an inherent part of the original AR-15 design, a cheek weld puts your eyes quite a bit further above the bore of the rifle than it does on a bolt action, lever action, or something like that. And we'll show that in the next diagram. So the line of sight to cross that front sight pin, and that's generally where the scopes are going to lay. That's why I say I like a folding front sight. Get that down out of my image. This is generally going to run about 2.5 to 2.7 inches above the bore line. We'll say 2.5 is the norm. Some optics are just a little bit higher. This is why, if you've done close work with an AR-15, if you're going to do a hostage rescue shot on someone, you know, bad guys holding a member of your family hostage, you want to hit him in the head but not hit their head, which is right below. You're going to have to aim 2.5 inches high at very close range to allow for that discrepancy between line of sight and the bore line. Now, as I said, the trajectory, I'll put it in here in orange. If this barrel were level, the trajectory would go like this, always going down. If I can get it to right, always going down like that. But since we sight it with a slight upward angle of departure on the barrel, what we are generally going to end up with is a trajectory that looks something like this. It comes up through the line of sight, it raises to a maximum ordinate, comes back through the line of sight, and then will drop further and further as the distance increases. I recommend a 50-yard zero. So let's say, for the sake of argument, we are zeroing at 50 yards. That's going to give us a maximum ordinate of about 1.7 inches, and that's going to occur at about 135 yards. So from 50 to there, it's never more than 2 inches above what we're aiming at. It's going to recross the line of sight at approximately 200 yards. And again, this will differ a little bit by muzzle velocity, weapon, if you're 2.5 or 2.7, little minor variations. But roughly, If you're on at 50 with this load, you're going to be on again at 200 yards. When you're sighted well, you're going to have 2 points where the trajectory of the bullet coincides with the line of sight. A close one and a far one. So if I call this a 50-yard zero, I'm correct. If I call this a 200-yard zero, I would be correct. Military folks, a lot of times, will choose a 37-yard sight. What that does is bring your maximum ordnance up a little higher to as high as 4 inches, but it's going to carry your second point of impact well out there. For the military, probably needing to shoot longer distances, that makes sense. But for civilians, for cops, for people who are working self-defense with these kind of rifles, I really think the 50 to 200 is the best zero. And as I say, that 200 is approximate. With my load in my rifle, it's actually about 210. At 300 yards, it will drop approximately 7 inches below my line of sight. So I can hold 7 inches high, still get a hit at 300 yards. Some reticles will give you additional aiming points for distances beyond your zero. So there might be a 300-yard aiming point. There might be a 400-yard aiming point, and I can deal with those here. But here's the beauty of this 50 to 200-yard zero. There's another concept in the sighting of optics, which is called maximum point blank range. And to do that, I set a tolerance. If I'm going to go deer hunting, I might say, I don't want a bullet that rises any more than 4 inches high or falls 4 inches low from my line of sight, my point of aim. That would give me an 8-inch circle. Plus 4, minus 4, gives me an 8-inch circle. If my rounds will always fall within that 8-inch circle over the vitals of a deer, then I don't have to worry about the distance. I don't have to have hold over or hold under. That will be allowed for. So what you're looking for there is a radius of 4 inches. 4 high or 4 low. For these, I think really probably a 2-inch, much tighter. So that means plus 2, minus 2. That's a 4-inch radius. My bullet is never going to be more than 2 inches high nor 2 inches low. So for center mass hold, I don't have to care what range it is. I don't have to determine range, estimate range, use a laser rangefinder or anything else. Beyond 200 yards, it's going to be ever more important to know that distance and to program for it. So if I've got a maximum point blank range of plus or minus 2 inches, my 50-yard zero does that because it's only 1.7 high in the middle. I can now calculate out where it's going to be about 2 inches low. My app tells me that's going to happen at about 250 yards. Now, if you can overlook the half-inch here, it's going to be a half-inch low at the muzzle. But by the time we get out to, say, 10 yards, it's going to be 2 inches low. From 10 yards to 250 yards, assuming a center mass aim on a humanoid target, as long as it's within from 10 to 250 yards, I just hold in the middle and I'm going to hit somewhere in that 4-inch circle in the center of the chest. 250 yards, even 200 yards, is a very long self-defense shot. You can't really justify shooting at someone with a handgun that far away because the chances of them hitting you at 200 yards is very rare. Now, obviously, if they have a rifle, then the limit of their rifle is now my acceptable killing range. But in most cases, it's not going to go beyond 200 yards. Most police shootings with patrol rifles are probably here. They're probably 25 to 35 yards. Sniper shots in the United States are said to average about 75 yards. So that makes 200 yards a long shot. 10 to 250 with 1-0 maximum point blank range. That's simplicity. Simplicity is always what's going to work best in a gunfight. All right, let's move over to our lower optics setting, which would be for a bolt action rifle, lever action rifle, something along those lines. Again, M193 55 full metal jacket at 3,050 feet per second. So we'll say this is a 16-inch barrel also. This distance is about 1.5 to 1.7 inches above the bore. If you look at iron-sighted lever actions, iron-sighted scope or bolt actions, their sight line will typically be less than an inch above the bore. But when we get these mounts and the scope up, it's going to run about 1.5. The larger objective bells, larger objective lenses on these scopes will force you to go to high mounts or even extra high mounts. So that can go up to 1.7 or 1.8 inches. The point is, measure from the center of your bore to the center of the scope and plug that in when you're using a ballistics app. So we will call this 1.5 inches for a normal bolt action rifle. Now once again, our trajectory, because of the angle of departure, is going to go up through the line of sight. It's going to peak at a maximum ordnance, back down through, and then fall ever sharper as it goes. Same load. So let's say we're going to use that same 50 to 200 yard zero. So our first point where it coincides is 50 yards. It's not going to impact now at 200 yards because we're only 1.5 inches above the bore instead of 2.5 inches above the bore. The higher the scope sits above the bore, the more pronounced the trajectory will be, and typically you can get longer points of impact. Maximum ordnance, how high this load is going to be above the line of sight, the point of aim, is only 0.4 inches. Almost too little to measure. But because that's tighter, this distance is going to come in much closer than it did with the AR-15. So our second point where the line of sight coincides with the trajectory of the bullet is 135 yards. On the AR-15, it was 2 to 210. On this lower sighting level, we're going to get another point cross at 135. So we could say it's zeroed at 50, it's zeroed at 135. Now, the 300 yard drop for the AR-15 was 7 inches. Here, the 300 yard drop is about 11 inches. So we have less reach in our maximum point blank range, and we have more drop when we go beyond it. And that is because the scope sits down tighter to the bore. Sights, which are going to be another perhaps 3/4 of an inch lower, are going to bring this number down, this number closer, and this number greater. The farther the optical line, the line of sight, gets above the bore, the further out it will go, the more distance you get, the less drop at long range. It's an unavoidable state of physics. So here, our maximum point blank range with a 4-inch, that's +2, -2, is from the muzzle, because we're not more than 2 inches below the line of sight to begin with. It's going to go 2 inches low at 190 yards. Now before, this was about 2 to 210 with the AR-15, so your maximum point blank range now is going to be at 190 yards. Still real close to 2, still real effective for self-defense use. But if this bolt action 5.56 is being used for varmint hunting at long range, or as a light sniper, the Navy in particular uses the Mark 12 light sniper rifle. They use the Mark 262 load. And the load is going to change the trajectory as well. But they're using this light caliber for sniping out to fair distances. But with our point blank range, we're going to get 0 to 190 yards. For most people in self-defense situations, that's good enough. So I will show you the use of a ballistic calculator as we go on into the next one, and I'm also going to talk about the types of scope. 1X, like a red dot, low power variable optics, higher power variable optics, even thermal and night vision as we go along. So I'm going to give you a pretty good primer on the types of optics you can mount on rifles. But I think this covers, these trajectory charts are pretty well going to cover the M193, same load, same barrel length. The only difference is the height of the scope, but it shows you the importance of plugging that into that app when you sight your rifle in and when you run that trajectory. So I hope this has been useful for you. If you like what I'm doing, please subscribe. If you need to subscribe again, YouTube cancels you out. I just got canceled out of Four Boxes Diner about a week ago, and I had to resubscribe, so that happens. If you like what I'm doing, give me a thumbs up. As always, leave your comments. If you think I know what I'm talking about, I'd love to hear it. If you think I'm full of crap, tell me why. I appreciate you viewing these videos, and this is based on some comments that I got. If you have things you'd like to see, by all means put them in the comments, and I'll try to work them into my plan for what I'm going to do along the way. So this is Dick Fairburn signing off. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, we got them both here now. You ready? Bud got one. Ginger got one. Oh, she missed it. She usually gets them, doesn't she, Bud? Okay, girl, last one. You ready? You ready? Yeah! That's all there is till next time.